So let me begin with the issue of, the wall, since that was on the poster. I think to myself as I walk around Palo Alto, and I know the Palo Alto very well. I was for 8 years a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, so I know the community. And on the face of it, it's a very open community. No walls. You can just walk right onto the campus and feel comfortable. You can sip your latte and so on. Where are the walls? This horrible Trump, he wants to build a wall. And then it occurred to me that Stanford actually has a wall. And it's a much bigger wall than any wall that Trump wants to build. And this wall is actually organized or controlled by the admissions office. It is the wall of admission to an elite community. And this wall is so tall and so opaque that, to my knowledge, in the entire history of the university, no one has ever scaled a wall. Think about it. Think of what it means to scale a wall. What it would mean at Stanford is for someone to sneak into Stanford, take classes for 4 years, and make off with a Stanford degree. Has anyone, to your knowledge, ever done that? No. And that means that Stanford, you, ruthlessly enforce this wall against outsiders. Your community decides who gets to be a member, and you will not allow any intruders, you will not allow any degree of compassion to allow someone to come in and claim the same degree that you and your parents are demanding of you, that's going to give you an advantage in the race of life over all those other people on the other side of the wall. And I think if you were honest, you would admit that this is true. And the only point I want to make in connection with the wall is that every community has this right. America has the right to say who gets to be a member of this society. And once America decides that democratically through laws, its job then is to be fair to the citizens and to non-citizens. I'm an example of somebody who had to come to America by standing in a very long line. I happen to come from a country very far away, so there's no question of swimming across the Rio Grande or tunneling my way under a fence. There's no way to get here that way. You have to stand in line. And so fairness is also fairness between the immigrant across the border and the immigrant in Bombay, India. You have to have the same rules apply to all of us. So that's the moral case for a wall. The moral case for a wall is simply the right of a community to decide democratically who gets to be a new member. And I think if you extend this right to Stanford, which you undoubtedly do, it's very difficult to say it should not belong to America. Let me now pivot to a deeper topic I want to address in a little more depth: social justice. What is the social justice argument all about? As I understand it, the social justice argument is quite new. In the 20th century, the century when I was in college, the debate was between capitalism and socialism, and that debate was really about which system was more efficient in creating wealth. And that argument was actually settled. One system won, capitalism won, and many people thought, that's it, socialism is done. Socialism will go away. Why? Because for Marx, as for Adam Smith, the issue of creating abundance was decisive. And capitalism seemed to have won on that critical score. But although capitalism won the economic debate, it never won the moral debate. And the moral debate is not about which system creates wealth. The moral debate is over how that wealth is distributed. What is a just allocation of that wealth? And interestingly, even if you go right back to Adam Smith, you don't find the moral defense of capitalism. Actually, Adam Smith's defense of capitalism is sort of indirect. In other words, the entrepreneur, by pursuing his or her selfish interests, through the invisible hand of competition, nevertheless advances the material welfare of society. It's a very half-hearted defense. And so I want to take the bull by the horns and ask, on what basis can we decide that the allocations of capitalism are just? Let's take an actual example of what I mean. Here in Palo Alto, there's a Ritz-Carlton, there's a Westin. Now imagine a guy who is a valet parking cars at the Ritz-Carlton here in Palo Alto. And this guy is paid, let's say, $15 an hour. And let's say that he works 10 hours a day, so he makes 150 bucks. And this guy is now thinking to myself, in those 10 hours, how many cars did I park? Well, I parked, let's say, 100 cars. And how much does the Ritz-Carlton charge for someone to park their car? $30. So how much should the Ritz-Carlton make as a result of me parking those 100 cars? $3,000. And how much was I paid out of that $3,000? $150. 3,000 minus 150 gives $2,850. Who gets that? So from the valet's point of view, this is a very unjust system because I'm doing the work and some other guy is taking the cash. And this argument about the injustice of capitalism is actually anchored in, I think, a rather interesting argument that was made by Marx himself. Marx basically said that when you have a business, an enterprise, there are two groups of people that are involved in making this enterprise go. There's capital, the capitalist, and there's labor. So the capitalist provides what? Capital. And capital, Marx says, has a cost, and that's called interest. So part of the cost of the business is to pay interest on the capital. And then Marx says there are other costs. There's rent, there's equipment, there's machinery, there's this, there's insurance, there's this, there's that. Add up all the costs, including the cost of paying labor, and you get total cost. That's the total cost of running a business. And Marx says, now you might expect that the product would be sold for that. But in fact, the capitalist will sell the product for the highest that the market will bear, as much as he can sell it for. And so there's a big difference between the revenue generated by the sales and the cost. And that difference Marx calls surplus value. We call it profit. And Marx's question, quite a profound question, who gets that? Now Marx's assumption is that that belongs 100% to labor. Why? Because labor made the goods. The capitalist supplied nothing more than the money, which has already been recompensed through interest. My view is that this description, convincing as it is on first glance, is a completely false representation of how businesses actually run. Consider for a moment the capitalist. In America today, the vast majority of capitalists supply a lot of things, but the one thing they do not supply is capital. Did Steve Jobs actually put up all the capital for Apple? No, he went to a bank. The bank supplied the capital. And this is true of Gates and everyone down the list. The bottom line of it, the capitalist supplies three things that Marx completely ignores, that are actually of far greater value than capital and actually entitle the capitalist to a share of the profit. But Marx, in a sense, submerges these three factors completely. First, the capitalist has the idea for the business. Without the idea, there's no business. Labor doesn't think of the idea, the capitalist does. It's his or her idea. They do it. Second, the capitalist organizes the business. Here you have this valet, he goes, I park the cars, I need all the money. The truth of it is, the reason you're getting $30 to park a car is you're at the Ritz-Carlton. Somebody built the Ritz-Carlton, somebody thought of it, somebody paid all the capital costs, somebody took out the insurance. You didn't think of that. If you come to my house and want to park my car, I'll pay you 50 cents. So the reason that you're getting $30 is not because of you. It's not your labor that's worth $30. It's the resort that's worth $30. And you didn't create that. So the capitalist has the idea for it, he organizes it, and third, he takes all the risk. Very important factor. The capitalist gets paid at the end. If the business has a bad quarter, Steve Jobs can't go, or the current Tim Cook can't go to Apple and say, sorry guys, I'm not going to pay you for 6 months. It's looking bad for us this half of the year. No, he has to pay them anyway. So labor is trading a fixed wage for security. But the entrepreneur is taking the risk that he might get nothing out of it, and he could even lose money. So the truth of the matter is that in fairly assessing the just rewards of capitalism, you have to match what the entrepreneur actually contributes. And to say it's just capital, it seems to me, is a gross misunderstanding how business is actually conducted in the United States and all around the world. Wow, I guess I'm getting warmed up. Now, the decisive issues that have made us crazy in the last 2 years, but longer than that. The reason that we have not had in this country any real debate about any issue, not even immigration, not even the court, not even taxes, not even North Korea, nothing. Why? Because we have had a swirling current of accusation aimed, of course, specifically at Trump, but more broadly against Republicans and conservatives. And this is the invective that basically says that Trump and his Trumpsters are... They're here. The charge of racism and the charge of fascism. Now, let's be fair. These are the two most incendiary accusations that you can make. You're a racist. You're a fascist. And they carry consequences, because if they're true, let's say Trump is a racist and he is a fascist, then you could argue that, well, Trump is like Hitler circa 1933. If Trump is like Hitler circa 1933, then we don't have to debate with him. We don't have to accept the result of the election. We would be justified in mobilizing whatever degree of force is necessary to try to overthrow him, because look at the dire consequences of letting Hitler do what he did after 1933. So it's very important whether or not these original premises are actually correct, are actually true. Now, for me to address this topic is a little bit strange. And it's a little bit strange for the following reason. Through my research, I find that on these basic topics, like fascism, many things that people, intelligent people, know to be true are not true. And one question I've actually thought a lot about is, how does that actually happen? If you take a college like Stanford, how could it be that a student or even a professor who studies a topic can know something about it that is not true? Let me suggest how I think that can happen. First of all, let's take a premise. And I'm going to use the premise that fascism is on the right. Fascism is on the right. Now, this is a very important premise for the left, because if fascism were not on the right, you couldn't call Trump a fascist. If fascism were on the left, it would make no sense to call Trump a fascist. You need the idea that fascism is on the right to get away with that charge. And so I ask you the question, how do we know that fascism is on the right? How do we know that? I will submit to you that prior to 1945, nobody thought that. Prior to 1945, the fascists and the anti-fascists all thought fascism was on the left. FDR knew that fascism was on the left. And yet after World War II, we got this new idea that fascism is on the right. So how can someone know this when no one at the time thought so? The way this works is something like this. A professor at the Tulane or Stanford history department will write a book, a controversial book, a polemic, fascism is on the right. His or her colleagues who are sympathetic ideologically go, great book, marvelous, breakthrough book. Pretty soon, favorable review in the New York Review of Books. Pretty soon, the guy's being interviewed on NPR. Michael Moore comes rolling in to do a documentary. Suddenly, people are putting it up on Wikipedia. It's on the History Channel. So here's what I mean. The intelligent person If you ask them, is fascism on the left or the right? They go, oh, fascism's obviously on the right. How do you know? Well, you know, I was in Barnes & Noble. I thought I saw something. My professor said something about it. I saw something on the History Channel. There it was on NPR. I type it into Wikipedia. Now, you don't realize this is the same intellectual bullet ricocheting from one wall to the other wall and coming back at you, but because you're observing the phenomenon in different manifestations, each one corroborates the other. Oh, wow, it has to be true. It has to be true. And what I want to do today is challenge these assumptions. It's a very hard thing to do, and the way I'm going to do it, focusing on racism and fascism, is what I call the crushing fact. The crushing fact. And I'm going to try to unleash a half dozen of these before I open the door to questions. The advantage of the crushing fact is, A, it's checkable. And that's the beauty of us living today. Whip out your phone, check it out. If what I say is true, then ask yourself if the premise can be sustained any longer. It's checkable. The second thing about the crushing fact is that we all are entitled to our own interpretations and opinions, but we're not entitled to our own facts. So facts have that ability to settle an argument. And there's a certain kind of raw beauty to that. So I want to talk briefly about fascism first, and then I'm going to talk about racism. And I'm going to try to unfurl these facts. And remember, these facts, by the way, are causing quite a scandal on social media. If you follow my social media, there's a fellow at Princeton, I call him a fake historian, but anyway, he's rounded up 124 historians to rail against these facts. Think of how powerful these facts are. Not one of them can be overturned, even though 124 professionals are trying every day. All right, let's talk about fascism. Now, one thing about fascism that's very interesting, I think, is that even though we use the word a lot, no one can really say what it means. You're a fascist! And this is very important because the actual use of the term, whenever it's used in conventional debate, if you just think about it for a moment, you realize that that can't be what it means. Trump is a fascist because he's an ultra-nationalist. I think I saw Bill Maher the other day. Trump wants to make America great again, just like Hitler wanted to make Germany great again. This is big thinker Bill Maher. Now, I ask you, if nationalism is essentially the defining feature of fascism, was Nelson Mandela a fascist? He was a nationalist. Was Mahatma Gandhi a fascist? He was a nationalist. What about Winston Churchill? He was a nationalist. So was de Gaulle, and so was Abraham Lincoln, and so were all the anti-colonial leaders, Nkrumah in Ghana, Fidel Castro, all these people fascists? Obviously not. Talk sense. Obviously we need a better understanding of what fascism really is. So fascism, one way to understand a phenomenon is to look at what Nietzsche calls the genealogy of it. How did we get it? How did it start? That'll give you a clue as to what it is. Now, the leading fascist, the founder of fascism, the first fascist regime in the world, not Adolf Hitler, Mussolini. Mussolini was actually Hitler's model. And the very interesting thing is that Mussolini was a Marxist. He was the editor of the socialist newspaper in Italy called Avanti. He knew that he was on the left. In fact, everybody knew he was on the left. Lenin was one of his friends. When Mussolini started the first fascist party, Lenin sent him a telegram of congratulations. Why? To a fellow socialist revolutionary, V.I. Lenin. Now, at that time, there was a huge debate going on in the West over what's called the crisis of Marxism. And the crisis of Marxism, very simple. Marx had predicted that there would be proletarian revolutions in all the industrialized countries, which did not occur. And the question was, why not? The Marxists had to figure out, what did Marx get wrong? And Mussolini, having fought in World War I, made this observation. He said, I noticed that the socialists in France all fought for France. I noticed the socialists in Britain all fought for Britain. And in Germany, the same thing. So, he says, class is not the only basis of worker solidarity. There's another factor that we've ignored, and that is the factor of nationalism. In other words, what we need is to marry nationalism to socialism for the first time, creating a new thing. Let's call it National Socialism. And this is the actual origin of fascism. It's the marriage of nationalism and socialism. And that's why Hitler's party was called, you already know, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Now, this fascism was very attractive to progressives in the United States. Progressives in the United States were mesmerized by fascism both in Italy and in Germany. And not only was there a traffic from America to fascism, in other words, Mussolini was sending members of his brain trust to Rome to study Italian fascism. He wanted to bring it here. He saw fascism as more progressive than the New Deal. I'm sorry, I meant FDR. Franklin D. Roosevelt was sending members of his brain trust to Mussolini's Rome. But it's also true that the fascists, for their part, were deriving and drawing on ideas from the United States. This is not known. And I want to give a single example, which I've dramatized in my movie, Death of a Nation. You'll see it. But if you see it, I would forgive you for being incredulous, because the scene that you see does not appear, to my knowledge, in any high school or college textbook. And yet, it is a fact. It's occurred. I have the documents. It's corroborated by mainstream historians, notably James Whitman at Yale. So the scene that you see in the movie is this. Leading members of Nazi Germany, 1935, are in a room, and they're drafting the so-called Nuremberg laws. And the Nuremberg laws are the laws that make Jews into second-class citizens. And they do three things. They segregate Jews into ghettos, they forbid intermarriage between Jews and other Germans, and they condone confiscation of Jewish property, in other words, state-sponsored discrimination against Jews. And the Nazis are sitting there, and they basically say, we want to make these laws, but there's no international precedent for them. Nobody has done this kind of thing. And then one of the Nazis who had studied in the United States says, actually, gentlemen, you're wrong. Somebody has beaten us to the punch. The Democratic Party in the United States has laws that do all the three things that we want. The Jim Crow laws of the American South have segregation, there are anti-miscegenation laws outlawing intermarriage, and they condone state-sponsored discrimination. All we have to do is take the laws of the Democratic Party, cross out the word black, write in the word Jew, and we are home free. What am I saying here? I'm not saying that the Nazis got a parallel idea. I'm saying the actual Nazis had in their hands the blueprints of the democratic laws and used it to make the Nuremberg laws, and this fact has been completely suppressed in progressive historiography in the United States. Now, I said that the Nazis were talking about the democratic laws, and you might be like, democratic laws? Aren't you talking about the Southern laws? See, the Nazis actually knew something that we don't know. Namely, every segregation law in the United States from the 1880s to the 1950s was passed by a Democratic legislature, signed by a Democratic governor, enforced by Democratic officials, and there is not a single exception to this rule. Once again, if you rush back to your political science textbook, this fact will be downplayed if not omitted. Why? And now we come to a little bit of the bigger picture here. The bigger picture here is that what we call history is progressive history. And we shouldn't be naive about this. The progressives themselves were fighting against earlier forms of history. And so the progressives were a kind of, you may say, intellectual militant movement that overthrew what came before them. And then in taking power, their power was in writing the history books, and that meant that they could spin the narrative and suppress facts inconvenient to their side. It's been done from the beginning of history. We should hardly be surprised it's being